Okay, so now we're talking about cucumbers in our vegetable course here. Um, this lesson has been heavily modified over the last couple of years, but uh, these two fellas, Tehran and Hardeep Singh, are graduates from our program, and their family runs Singh Greenhouses up in Waterdown. Uh, they used to come as guest lecturers and teach this lesson. Uh, anyways, not anymore with COVID and stuff like that. So I've adapted it once again and added a bunch of stuff, but it's an interesting lesson. And cucumber spills over from this week into next week a little bit, and then we'll be doing review for the midterm. So let's dive right in. So 20 years ago, uh, vegetable greenhouses were quite a bit smaller. And at 18 to $20 for a flat of cucumbers compared to current prices, 10 to $12. And keep in mind, this is winter pricing. That price drops when the summer comes. It's almost always like that. Field production comes on from California and other parts of the world and compete. So, but it's interesting that, despite higher operating costs in modern greenhouses, we still get paid less, but we've improved our efficiency so much that we're still profitable. So typically, cucumbers that are grown in greenhouses are of a parthenocarpic variety, which means that they produce fruit without pollination. Um, if you look in our cucumber house, you'll see there's always a cucumber already forming on the vine, and that is because it is not looking for pollination. Although even the traditional cucumbers, as you see here, they will the female flowers will have sort of a mini cucumber on them, and the male flowers were not. That's how you would tell the difference. But in our particular variety here, that's just not the case. These are auto flowering and automatically produce fruit, and it's obviously seedless because there's been no fertilization, right? That's the whole point of it. Just like your seedless watermelons and stuff like that. And if you're wondering how they do that, they've bred them to combine a diploid and a tetraploid. And of course, then the progeny are triploids, which means with three sets of chromosomes, it's highly unlikely, not impossible, but highly unlikely that you'll have a viable seed because no one seed would have enough chromosomes to be viable. So that's how they do that. Anyways, typical varieties grown. This is what we're growing this year, this winter, not in the fall. Camaro, Verdon is a popular one. There's many. You go to any commercial seed supplier and there's all kinds of varieties. Some of them are just numbers. Um, there's always trade-offs. Flavor, yield for disease resistance, all these things. And so farms generally have varieties that work well in their greenhouses, and that's what they grow. Typically, we're looking for thin skin because greenhouse cucumbers are not meant to be peeled. And interesting, all greenhouse varieties are what we call burpless. Maybe you've read this before, but you never really understood what that meant. Uh, what that means is like normal cucumbers, actually a lot of heirloom cucumbers, have not had this cucurbitacin molecule bred out of them. And when you eat them, well, that should be breed, whatever. That should be, there's no A there. I'll fix that. Embarrassing. Um, the cucurbitacin makes your stomach upset, makes you burp. No kidding. So, yeah, burp less. Anyways, maybe I spent too much time on that. I find that humorous, but anyways. So we typically have what like summer and winter varieties, right? So Camaro is sort of it works well in both seasons, but it's definitely a good winter variety. At least that's been our experience at the college. So, but farms, they plant multiple crops a year, so they may shift between the two types of crops that they're going to plant for that time of the year to maximize yield and minimize, other problems like disease, powder mildew, and things like that. The main two types of cucumbers grown are English. which are your long, sometimes they're called Dutch varieties. Although I think the Dutch ones tend to be a little shorter. They're not as long. And then there's these mini snackers. They're called lots of different names. Champagne, I don't know. We just call them minis. They're about a third of the size of a full size English cucumber. So tiny little cucumbers, but they are crazy. They produce like bonkers. We grew mini cucumbers the previous 2 years at the college, and to be honest, we just couldn't keep up with them because of the way our classes were scheduled, and the greenhouse staff were not really on top of that, so they would just go bonkers, and it turned into a bit of a disaster. So we decided we would take a break this year and not run minis. But we do usually grow, one of the troughs in the cucumber house would be minis. So one organic, one minis, and one English. But there's definitely a lot of labor. But these are very popular. They're fairly new in the industry, very popular for the snacker element, right? Parents are looking for healthy alternatives to put in their kids' lunch boxes, or even just for themselves at work, and they're convenient. I mean, you could, in theory, just cut up a cucumber and put that in your lunch as well, like a full-size English. But these don't dry out. It's a convenient resealable bag. They have decent taste. There's not as much flesh. There's more of the skin, which gives a little bit more flavor. I don't know. I kind of like them. I know when we grew them at the college, we sold a lot. People were really excited about them. So, anyways, fair number of minis out there in production. When you're propagating commercial cucumbers, like most commercial varieties, but particularly the cucumbers, the seeds are very expensive. You're looking about $1 a seed, and it's partly because of just the overall yields, and because they're producing parthenocarpic ones, which means they have to maintain two different parents, a tetraploid and a diploid. So there's a lot going into those seeds. They're not typically grafted, so that's nice. At least it's just, one and done seed. But typically they're seeded directly into a block, whether it's coir or rock wool. And then up here, they're grown on. These are in propagation houses. These are flood floors. The whole floor floods with water, and that's how they irrigate them. Germination is typically on the warm side. I mean, everything about cucumbers is warm for the most part. I don't know if this density really matters to you or not, but that's just basically the spacing inside these houses. I mean, at the end of the day, it's partly a business decision, but also making sure that they don't end up with weak stems or stretched or falling over. I mean, they all have bamboo stakes. Actually, that's probably the latest thing that a lot of the propagation houses is putting automated machines in that stick these bamboo sticks in every block, because that's a huge job to do manually. So that's something that I've heard a couple of propagators investing in. Once they reach about what we call 4 or 5 leaf stage, which is about a foot tall or 30 centimeters, then they're placed on the bag. Here we got 1, 2, 3, 4 per bag. You might see 3. We do 3 at the college just because we can. But usually you're looking at around a month to, basically 18 to 25 days from germination before you're putting these things in. They grow fast. It's pretty impressive. I'm sure that between classes you'll begin to see huge differences in how fast the cucumbers are growing. So they're definitely fast. Um, when you have your young plants on your bags, it's like with the tomatoes and the peppers, we want to encourage rooting. So that means they're rooted when you don't pull them off the bag easily, right? That means the roots have penetrated into the slab and they're established. Typically, we'll try to keep less day-night temperature variation at that stage, which keeps the plant slightly more vegetative and the roots more aggressive and rooting out the bag. There's not a lot else we can do, right? Like, playing with humidity with, Tomatoes and peppers is a possibility, but cucumbers just seem to love humidity, so that doesn't really help us trying to keep the crop vegetative. So, and then of course your when you're established, your summer temperatures around 24, set your venting. In the winter, not quite as hot, but still warm. Uh, Nothing crazy, but they definitely like it warm and humid. pH tends to be on the higher side for younger plants. Bit easier on them, but CO2 sometimes is already used. I keep starting from the bottom and going up. Uh, I don't know if people use CO2, maybe a little bit. It does. I mean, you're growing aggressively all the time with cucumbers, so I suppose what that basically means is that it just about any time CO2 is useful. Um, but it really depends on your greenhouse and the climate. Is it really hot? Are you venting? Above a certain amount of venting, CO2 just doesn't make sense anymore. So um, try to keep our leach EC. So the EC in our leach, right? We're going to try to keep that low, right? And well, we're going to see that it's low because for the most part, the plants are actively pulling the nutrients out from the water, and that will result in a lower EC coming out the other side of the bag. That's not always the case. It's just for younger plants, right? As they're aggressively rooting in. Once the plants are mature, so let's move past that first few, 2, 3 weeks of growth. This is the vast majority of the year. We're running our normal pHs that we would expect to see. Our day-night temperatures, 24 versus 19 at night. It's a pretty decent spread, but generally speaking, that is to keep our source sink moving so that our sugars flow to the fruit, right? Remember that drop, that pre-night dip and stuff like that? It doesn't happen so much in cucumbers, but we do the prolonged day-night differential, and that seems to be sufficient for cucumbers. Now, as far as ECs go, less is often more, right? To a point, right? And this particular graph I scammed from a Grodan publication. They make rock wool slabs, and what they were looking at was the yield of cucumbers and comparing it to the EC in the irrigation water. So that's the water being supplied to the bags, right? Not what's necessarily in the bag, but what's being supplied to the bag. And as that supply EC went up, yield went down. So, keep an eye on your ECs. Now, the rule of thumb with any irrigation with rock wool or coir slabs is that the plant should always transpire before you irrigate. That's the phrase, transpiration before irrigation. It's the same with tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers, and I don't care what. That's the rule. Um, you don't start throwing water on someone who's under water before they've come up to get a breath. Think of it like that. So your roots are wet, maybe from the night, it's dried down a little bit. Before the plant takes off for the day, you don't smother with irrigation at this point. You're going to let it dry down, then you're going to irrigate, right? So be mindful of that. In the morning, typically we give larger shots to refill the bag to make up for what's drained away. And then during the day, we do maintenance, smaller shots. Now, talking about leach, typically you're looking at around 25 to 30% leach. I think that's a bit on the high side, but uh, I've seen leaches as low as 7% with cucumbers. Um, but at the end of the day, what we're looking at is we want to reduce salt content in the root zone. So there's a couple of trade-offs. If you can imagine, if this is my slab here, and I have a dripper here and a dripper here, right? And my slab it's got nutrients throughout the entire bag, and the plants have been pulling water out. So let's say the EC is kind of high in the bag because the plants have been concentrating it by removing water, depending on conditions, but so when we're irrigating, we want to give enough shots that we're displacing this entire volume into the leach. If we do really long, hard shots of water, what ends up happening is the water goes down directly through the media and then leaks out the bag to the leach and has not had time to displace the nutrients or the solutions that are in the remainder of the bag. So you would end up with heavy leach right near the dripper, and this part of the bag may end up having very high EC and the roots don't infiltrate. So it's a trade-off. We want to irrigate smoothly enough that we're displacing the solution in the bag, but not so rapid that we're leaving behind sections that are not being influenced by what we're putting into the bag. That also has to do with the holes that we put in the slab, right? So if the slope of your trough is this direction, typically you would have one hole at the bottom end of the bag, maybe 2 or 3, depending on your media substrate that you've decided to go with. But the idea is that the entire bag has to leach out, which means you are influencing more of the bag per se. Just another strategy. But, you know, this graph kind of shows what's going on in a typical slab. Over on this side, we have the supplied water. And over here, we have the average EC in the drain. So this is what's inside the slab. Sorry. Highlighted the wrong part. This is in the slab, and this is in the drain. So what we're seeing here, to be clear, is let's say if we have an EC of 4 in the slab, you can expect an EC of 6 in the drain. So if you are not seeing that EC, if you put a probe into the bag and you measure an EC in the bag of 4, and your EC is coming out as a 3 in the drain, that means that your supply solution is passing right through the bag and you're not influencing the nutrients. Or something else might be wrong, but that's typically the case. So just be aware that, we want to displace the slab nutrients when we irrigate. All right. So we got to make sure that we're irrigating enough and at the right frequency. So, okay, that's enough about irrigation. Let's look at with relative humidity, as far as the climate is concerned, is a big one for cucumbers, because obviously powdery mildew, which we'll talk a little more about diseases next week in cucumbers, but powdery mildew is a big issue with cucumbers. I've talked about this many times before. That 80, 50%, if we go above 80, we get hyphal expansion, and if we go below 50, we get sporulation. So we can either make our problem worse or grow it worse by going outside those ranges of humidity. And so it's important that we maintain the proper 65 to 80% relative humidity for cucumbers. One of the things we can do, of course, is heat and burp, so we can heat the air and ventilate to reduce humidity if we're heading close to the top end of the spectrum. If we're going to go over 80%, then we're going to do that. The other thing we can do is burn sulfur pots, right? That's these things. They essentially have a cup. This cup goes in the top, and this is a little heating element that screws in underneath, and this device takes elemental sulfur, so yellow sulfury granules that you put in the cup, and the heat from this goes up the center of the tube and melts the sulfur in the cup, and then the sulfur gives off hydrogen sulfide into the atmosphere, which is toxic to the powdery mildew on the leaves and prevents their growth and successful reproduction. And of course, you do this in the middle of the night for a short time, anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour, depending on your density of sulfur pots and other factors, but not during the day when the staff are there. And you want to minimize your sulfur pot on time so you don't impact your bios too heavily. I think some people will say, oh, don't do it, it impacts your bios, but the small amount that it knocks your bios back is worth having less powdery mildew issues in your crop for all the impacts it has on yield and plant vigor. Supplementing with carbon dioxide with cucumbers is very common. They seem to respond well to carbon dioxide. But when you supplement with carbon dioxide, and we'll talk a little bit more about this again later in the term, you elevate the temperatures in the greenhouse. So if you elevate CO2 but don't raise the temperatures, you don't really get the benefit from the CO2. So this is just a rough guide for how you would adjust temperatures according to CO2 levels. Now this is related to nighttime, day. Interesting thing about nighttime, plants don't absorb, or cucumbers don't absorb CO2 at night. But we're trying to deal with more sugars being made because of our elevated CO2. So by having warmer night temperatures, we're helping facilitate sufficient movement from source to sink in the cucumber plant. So that's why we elevate the night temperature, but it's not significantly more. I mean, it's no different than under highlight conditions. But when we get into the daytime temperature, we're about a degree warmer. And when we're ventilating, with ventilation, you're maintaining about 28 degrees Celsius with carbon dioxide. I think with vents, everyone has their own perspective on this, but above a certain percentage of ventilation, it doesn't make sense to supplement with CO2 anymore because there's too much stirring of the air in the greenhouse and the CO2 is lost out the vents. I'm going to say 25% open with the vents. But again, everyone has their own ideas and every greenhouse is slightly different. So it's hard to just give you a hard and fast number. But you should be aware that if it's hot enough that your vents are aggressively opening, then you should consider stopping CO2 supplementation. Looking at cucumber nutrition, this is sort of a typical recipe. And all I really want to highlight here is that potassium levels are a fair amount higher than nitrogen. Cucumbers definitely need potassium. There's a lot of osmotic stuff going on there. Cucumbers are rapidly expanding, so we need to make sure they have enough potassium. That's probably one of the more common nutrient deficiencies you see in cucumbers if they're not getting enough potassium. So, and then yeah, watering with par. I don't know how that got misplaced, but talk briefly about substrates. You have your choice of rock wool or you have coconut coir. We've talked a little bit about this as you've been at the college, but I want to just talk briefly about these two in the context of hydroponic vegetable production. Whether it's peppers, tomatoes, or cucumbers, is kind of universally applicable. Coconut coir is obviously biodegradable, which is awesome. That can also play into your marketing, although people don't seem to care so much about or understand hydroponics, so I don't know if that works here. Has worked in places like Holland. It is less expensive than rock wool. That can be a bonus. In the early days, I don't know if this is as much of an issue. In the early days, the bags, if they were not leached prior to use, you could have a very high EC in the bag, and it would actually suppress root growth. But last couple of times we've ran coir and leached the bags, not much came out, so EC wise. Once coir's been wet, you should not let it dry out because it will not rehydrate very well. It's very similar to peat moss in that regard. Now, having said that, it's pretty hard to dry coir out. It holds on to water for a long time. Okay, from an everyday growing perspective, this is probably a big one related to what I just said about water taking a long time to dry out of these. They are much slower to change. So if you're changing your fertilizer recipe, you're adjusting for a bunch of sunny weather or you're heading into the spring versus winter, the coir doesn't leach through nearly as well as rock wool does. Where rock wool you can leach literally within, half an hour or to an hour. With coir, you're looking at probably a couple of days to properly change the nutrients that are in that bag to whatever your new formulation is. Um, Another thing that's an issue with coir is that sterilization and recirculation can be an issue. For example, the tannins can interfere with UV sterilization um, by blocking the light. And uniformity can be an issue. If your bags, it's not like Rockwool where it's all made from the same rock and molten and blended. They're coconut husks, and depending on where they came from, there's different consistencies or chunkiness. Um, so that can be an issue. Haven't really seen that, but it can be an issue. Looking at Rockwool, it absorbs water very well. You can lay it down on the trough and start irrigating it right away. Whereas coconut coir, you have to put drippers in for anywhere from 2 to 3 days to hydrate the bags. Whoa, that's terrible. 2 to 3 days to hydrate the bag. They are recyclable, but that doesn't happen very much. And probably more importantly, from a growing perspective, they are definitely easier to manage your leach with, right? So you can maintain a consistent leach and you can control what's in the bag a lot better. They're definitely more expensive, and they require more attention, right? So one of the nice things about coir is that, say it's Sunday and the pump breaks or a tank splits and you have no water, the plants aren't going to wilt within half an hour. Where with Rockwool, if you don't have water, they go south real fast. So there's very little leeway for error with Rockwool. So you got to be on your game. Okay, now I want to talk about two different production systems that are employed with cucumbers. One is the high wire method, which is what we're using at the college, and the other is umbrella or low wire. Now we used to have both, but when we started growing organic, we took out the low wire section, partly because I think going forward in the future, high wire will be the predominant method for production. Um, but that's not to say that low wire is going to go away necessarily, because older greenhouses that are maybe a little lower in the gutter are still very useful. So, farms are not necessarily going to, abandon a greenhouse if it's still productive. And essentially what happens is with the high wire, your greenhouse structure, like modern greenhouses, are typically quite tall. And that allows us to grow the plants for a much longer time as they get higher up and move them along, which means you can do about 2 crops in a year with high wire. That yield is significantly more compared to low wire. We are looking at around 200 cucumbers per square meter in production over the year. Downside of high wire is that it's a little more labor intensive. You're looking at around 2.5 employees per acre to maintain the crop. So that's doing your plant management and harvesting. You also have to buy more equipment. You need electric scissor lift carts, you need hooks and string and things like that. So there's more costs associated with it. Typically, this is what it looks like. You've got your slab and your plants. It's sometimes called tilt and lean, but that's the basic gist of it. And this is what a high wire cucumber house would look like. Plants are going straight up and they'll just keep going up, and then they'll just lower them and advance them, and then lower them and advance them with new growth happening. And that's the same as with the tomatoes. Obviously not peppers, but so high wire, pretty effective system. I like it. I like the openness of it. With low wire or umbrella, this is kind of what a typical crop looks like. The greenhouse is not as high to the gutter, so you need some height, especially when you're heading into warmer days. If you're too high in the greenhouse, that hot air near the top influences your crop, and you get all sorts of problems, burn and whatnot. But this diagram helps explain how low wire works. So you plant your crop and it grows up, and then you hang it over 2 wires and then let it hang down the other end, and eventually you cut that end off. And in the meantime, as you've been going, you let the odd sucker grow. So this sucker is allowed to grow, then the next sucker is allowed to grow. You might skip one, then another sucker, and then skip one, and then another sucker, and then another sucker, and then you're done. Help with the diagram here. There's a lot less labor because you're not removing as many suckers, and you don't have to tilt and lean the crops per se. So there's definitely less labor. So you're looking at, anything under 14 feet to the gutter or less is where you see your umbrella style. I don't know if you saw the umbrella is because of this shape, right? So that's why they call it umbrella. You turn more crops in a year, 3 to 4 crops in a year. So you've got to go back to that seed supplier and pay for young plants more frequently. So that's a cost. You have less production, on average about 150 cucumbers per square meter versus 200 for high wire. Fewer plants per bag because of the density of all the vines everywhere. So that would account for some of the differences in the yields, right? Because you're looking at around 20 to 30 cucumbers per plant complete before it's ripped out with a low wire crop. There's definitely less labor, as indicated by, on average, farms are looking at 1.5 employees per acre to maintain it. One of the nice things about having 3 to 4 crops in a year, right? Remember, 3 to 4, we're turning more crops, is that you reduce your risk, right? So powdery mildew tends to start showing up in crops as they age. Say you have canker in your stem or you've got some viral outbreak, you're going to rip it out shortly and put a new crop in again. So depending on where you're at, you mitigate your crop risks. Things are cleaner more often. So once you top the plant, then you get a change in the hormones distribution. The plants become much more generative, and they start producing fruit. They produce fruit pretty much right away as cucumbers, but they definitely want to produce lots of fruit when they're at that point. This is it's actually an Ontario grower, Magri Greenhouses. They're a low wire producer. You can see it's actually a low tech kind of arch double poly greenhouse. They've got gable venting here. But remember, cucumbers don't need high tech glass houses. They do very well under poly. So if you compare high wire to what you saw on that last slide, the plants are looser, they're taller. Looking at, comparing them, high wire on the left and low wire on the right, it's a very different crop. This kind of looks a little messy. It's harder for the staff to reach in and find all the fruit necessarily. Here it's easy to see. Plus, if you're spraying, not that you want to know this, but it does happen. And when you're spraying, you have good penetration into the canopy with high wire. Whereas with low wire, there's so many leaves, it's hard for the chemicals to get into that canopy. So you don't get nearly as good control with your pesticide application. As far as standard water treatment with cucumbers, this is a cascading cloth filter. We talked about that in Greenhouse Technical. Then they move on. This is how Sing Farms does it, by the way. Then they move on to UV disinfection, right? So there's your UV lamp inside that cylinder. Then they finalize the water with a biofilter. And we're going to talk about biofilters next week in Greenhouse Technical. But essentially there's a whole bunch of plastic structures in here, just like in our aquaponics system. And the water percolates through, and there's bacteria in these films that will consume pathogens and produce antibiotics and whatnot that will clean the water, so that when you collect it out the bottom, you get clean water for your crops. It's actually a pretty slick system for producing clean water. Sing Farms does this. Beverly Farms does this. Yeah, biological filters are pretty cool. Um, Sing Farms also has reverse osmosis, partly because their well water is low quality. So when they're replenishing the water that the crop uses, because obviously your plants are transpiring, so you lose moisture to the atmosphere, right? So they have to add water from the well, and they have to use reverse osmosis to get rid of things like sodium from their water. So pretty large scale reverse osmosis. As far as pests or integrated pest management, uh, it's all the usual culprits. I don't want to, waste too much of your time on this. We've covered it a lot. But interestingly, around 10,000 per acre is spent by Sing Farms on their biologicals. Um, that's fairly high. They're releasing a lot of bios. Um, but things like aphids and whatnot, they can reproduce very quickly, and you got to stay on top of them. So here's your Persimolis for the mites, your Aureus or minute pirate bug, Swirsky or Cucumaris. For whitefly, you have your Encarsia. For aphids, it's a combination of the crawling lacewing larva and then Aphidius colemanni and abdominalis, the flying wasps. All very effective if you stay ahead of your game and are scouting and catching problems early and releasing in those hot spots right away. Interesting thing about cucumbers, if you let them stay on the vine too long, first of all, on top of becoming too large for your quality control with customers, they actually inhibit new fruit set. So if you leave these, you go away for a weekend and you don't go in and harvest the cucumbers, you got to harvest just about every day. It will actually reduce the fruit set further ahead, so you actually impact your overall yield. So you've got to stay on top of these things. As far as nutrient disorders with cucumbers, they are particularly sensitive to chlorides. So city water, you got to be very careful to make sure that there's no chlorides in there. You get light green symptoms in the leaves or in the margins. It looks almost like potassium deficiency. It's a bit strange. You definitely don't want to go over 0.8 ppm of chlorides. So you would not be using chlorine to disinfect for cucumbers, right? So be very careful with that. So that may or may not be, it would not be a smart idea to use ECA with cucumbers. Remember we talked about ECA in Greenhouse Technical? ECA, electrochemically activated with potassium chloride, right? So that's something you're not going to be using with cucumbers. And also, when you're trying to put your fertilizer formula together, you're definitely not going to be using calcium chloride to get your calcium levels up to where they need to be. You're going to use calcium nitrate pretty much exclusively for your calcium. You could use calcium phosphate too if you had to. If you have high salts, so if your ECs have gotten out of hand, you're going to get yellow margins on your leaves. I should mention cucumbers tend to have a little bit of a yellow margin. It's not that uncommon, so I don't get too uptight about it, but if you start seeing a lot of it, then keep an eye on your salt levels. Some other common fruit disorders. I do have a document in this week's folder on this. Curling fruit or oblong shaped. We saw a lot of this in the fall. This is primarily related to temperature, so if it's too cold, or insufficient water, especially when the plants are undergoing a lot of transpiration, which is what we had in the fall with the HPS lights on, cooking the plants and being very dry. The plants were transpiring lots, and as the fruit was rapidly expanding, there wasn't enough water to fill that water bottle of the cucumber, so it was misshapen, like a balloon that's not fully inflating. And then there's mechanical injury, plastic support rings. The cucumber grows into the ring, and then as it expands, it girdles it. Those are probably the three more common scenarios we would see. Our little greenhouse to the college, we have outside edge, so on the one corner, it's cold on these two outside walls. The rest of the greenhouse is warm, right? But these outside walls, depending on the weather, we can have cold conditions there. And we'll see curling of the fruit sometimes in those corners. Now, if you have a very big greenhouse, the outside edges are a relatively small component of your crop, but for us, it's fairly large. Looking ahead at some of the interesting research, again, this document's in the folder for this week, and I think we might look at it again in more detail when we talk about grow lights and greenhouse technical. But there's always interest in LED lighting, and there's lots of research and trials. Although with cucumbers, it's mostly powdery mildew resistance, pest resistance, virus resistance. Flavor is less of a consideration in the breeding programs. Things like shelf life and disease resistance are more important. There's a lot of work going on in developing organic production. Now, most of that research is pretty proprietary. Every farm has their own methods, but there's more and more organic acres for a cucumber. And everything, but cucumber seems to work very well. I ended up with this line twice. Interesting. Harvest automation, I already showed you a video on cucumber harvesting. So yeah, there's lots of that going on. I think we're a few years away from that being realistic. Cogeneration, a lot of farms experimenting with it because cucumbers respond so well to CO2. It is an obvious combination to have. I know like Great Northern Hydroponics has cogeneration, Beverly Greenhouses has cogeneration. In this day and age with the energy costs and stuff like that, it's definitely an interesting approach, right? This is where you use a natural gas-fired engine to make electricity, and the exhaust from the gas from the engine is put into the greenhouse as CO2. So you produce heat from the engine, which goes into the greenhouse. You produce CO2 from the engine, which goes into the greenhouse, and you produce electricity, which goes into the greenhouse. So it's a pretty slick system. This is some slides I pulled from that LED paper comparing cucumber production under LED versus HPS, and it was interesting that for top lighting, so up here it says top lighting, for top lighting applications, the HPS made a difference and the LEDs did nothing compared to control. So this is through the winter to spring months. Yeah. Now, LED intercrop lighting did help when they did some experiments. There's good coloration on the mini cucumbers compared to control. That translates into good flavor, slightly less bitter. The stem diameter was definitely better on LED with intercrop lighting, and similar to HPS top lighting. So that was a benefit. But as with all things, I think there's a lot of work needs to be done on that to make sure it's actually viable. With the HPS lights, we get that radiant heat, which helps dry the boundary layer of the cucumber leaves and reduces powdery mildew. So I still think if you're going to light a cucumber house, that HPS is a better way to go. But to be honest, a lot of cucumber houses are not lit with lights because they're fairly efficient at using what light they get for their yield. So you got to be able to justify the expense. Now maybe you got a peak price in the market or a niche market so you can light a smaller part of your greenhouse and make it worth your while. I think maybe cucumbers might be the first LED crop. I don't know. It's hard to say. The lights have got to get better, to be honest, in my opinion. All right. I'll see you at the greenhouse sometime. All right. Bye.